Wesley founded Methodism. Let's put it in our notes. John Wesley founds a new kind of Christianity denomination called Methodism, which grew from his early commitment to self-examination and self-discipline, the method of belief and worship. His preaching was very influential because it met the need for a renewed sense of personal religious experience. I want to look really quickly in this box on page 472, the British tradition, close-up on daily life. Proper behavior for children. You'll be interested maybe in this. The 18th century focus on proper conduct applied to children as well. One book on this subject was entitled Rules for Children's Behavior at Church, at Home, at Table, in Company, in Discourse, at School, Abroad, and Among Boys. That is quite a title, 1701 by the way. Here are some of the rules for behavior in company. Some of you will say, this sounds very much like what I was taught when I was in elementary school. Sit not down in the presence of superiors without bidding. In other words, when children came into the room, they were not allowed to sit until they were told by an adult they could do so. Sing not, nor hum in thy mouth while thou art in company. No singing allowed. Play not wantonly like a mimic with thy fingers or thy feet. In other words, don't shuffle your feet. Stand not ringing with thy body hither and thither, but steady and upright. In other words, when you stand, don't move. In coughing or sneezing, make as little noise as possible. If thou cannot avoid yawning, shut thy mouth with thine hand or handkerchief before it, turning thy face aside. Laugh not aloud, but silently smile upon occasion. All of these were proper behavior for children. Interesting. Let's keep going on 473. Notice the next question. What is the relationship of the writer to tradition? In this period, some literary traditions reach a magnificent conclusion, and some wholly new forms emerge from the chaos of civil war and revolution to meet the needs of a growing literate middle-class audience. Notice this question. What effects did the Renaissance and Reformation have? First heading. From love to religion. John Donne is a child of the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical learning and themes that began in the 15th century, and Reformation, the efforts to reform Christianity that led to the birth of Protestantism. He begins as a witty love poet and ends as the dean of the old St. Paul's Cathedral, which burned in 1666. His early lyrics continue the Elizabethan tradition, but his holy sonnets change the sonnet from a love poem to a religious meditation. Work based on the classics. Next heading. Ben Jonson's poetry is restrained and graceful, like the classical poetry he admired. Poets who succeeded him, the tribe of Ben, often produced brilliant poems on the Carpe Diem theme. Carpe Diem, Latin for seize the day. And the speakers in the poems, male, urge their audience, female, to forget inhibitions and take advantage of the fleeting hours of life. Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress adds a serious undertone suggesting the real ravages of time. Renaissance and Reformation, the last heading on 473. John Milton's work embodies almost all the traditions of both the Renaissance and Reformation. Able to read Greek, Latin, Hebrew, French, and Italian, he wanted to give English an epic poem to match those of Homer and Virgil. He first considered an epic based on the legends of King Arthur because Homer and Virgil had based their epics on mythic histories of their countries. A devout son of the Reformation, however, he decided that the fit subject for an English epic was the Bible's story of creation and fall. When the hated monarchy had been restored, the poet, blind and disillusioned with politics, dictated his poem about the fall from Eden and the promise of a Redeemer who will restore the human race to its rightful heritage. We will pick up, of course, the whole notion of Paradise Lost here in a while. Notice the essential vocabulary words, literate, heritage, and prophet, also on page 473. All of these words potentially ending up, of course, in the exam. Let's look on 474 quickly. The next question, how did Milton create a new role for the poet? Poet is prophet. In his writing, Milton addressed the English as if he were an Old Testament prophet, thundering at a people that had broken its covenant with God. Milton created the role of poet as prophet, a poet reminding a nation of the path from which it had strayed. This idea of the poet had a strong influence on subsequent literature. In the Romantic period, we'll pick it up in Senior B, The poets William Blake and Percy Bysshe Shelley assume the role. Another romantic, Wordsworth, despairing of the state of England in 1802, writes, "Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour. England hath need of thee." Milton in some ways becomes the stereotype of that great voice of a return to certain kinds of high standards. Final question on page 474. What new forms arose for new audiences? The heroic couplet. I hope you've written this in your notes. The heroic couplet. Milton's influence was not felt immediately. With the end of the Civil War and Puritan rule, poets sought a new mode of expression for a new social order. That mode was the heroic couplet. Iambic pentameter lines linked in rhyming pairs. I hope you've got the definition there. Write it down. Heroic couplet is iambic pentameter lines. Remember iambic pentameter from our Renaissance study. Pa-pum, 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 right? If this be error and upon me proved, right? But you're going to have rhyming at the end of the pairs. You can say it this way for your notes. We are talking in the heroic couplet about Shakespeare's final rhymed couplet, the last two lines of any sonnet. This form perfectly suited an urbane aristocratic society that valued clever talk. With the genius of Alexander Pope, the form reaches its peak. The variations he creates within the rigid form give his poetry its vitality. Write that down. Alexander Pope's heroic couplets, very influential. The next heading and last heading on 474, the essay and the novel. Two new forms came into being in this period to meet the demands of a new middle-class audience, the essay and the novel. Both require a literate audience with money to spend on periodicals and books and leisure time to fill, an audience who want to read about people like themselves and people they would like to be. The essay is a secular sermon teaching lessons about life. Where sermons are delivered in houses of worship, essays depend on publication in periodicals to reach their audience. Write the word periodical down. It's what we mean by journal or newspaper. At the same time, periodicals relied on essays to attract readers. That marriage produced an enduring form whose offspring includes today's newspaper columns, television news, and commentary shows. The novel had its roots in quasi-religious narratives, the life story of a man or woman struggling to survive and be virtuous in a world that is hostile, evil, or simply indifferent. Coming into flower in the middle of the 18th century, the novel is the beginning of a style of literature, self-conscious, self-analytical, socially concerned, that will dominate coming centuries. You might want to pay attention to the contemporary connection on page 475. This is an interesting little box of reading. Let's look at it real quickly. John Milton, epic poet or computer visionary? John Milton wrote his great epic Paradise Lost in the mid-1600s. So what could Milton's poetic description of hell possibly have in common with artificial intelligence, the technology of thinking machines? Pandemonium, that's what. Paradise Lost describes how Satan was ousted from heaven and set up his own domain. Milton actually created the word pandemonium to name Satan's capital city. It is based on the Greek word pan, meaning all, and the Latin word dominionation, meaning demons. Pandemonium is the place where all the devils gather to argue about which diabolical scheme they will pursue next. Satan, of course, makes the final decision. In 1958, Oliver Selfridge, a computer pioneer, thought Milton's word for the capital of the netherworld was perfect to describe a system of processing information. In Pandemonium, as he refers to computers, there are 4 levels of demons. Demons are the working parts of the computer program. The lowest demons receive data. Higher level demons accumulate and shout out their data. Like Satan, the top demon makes the decision about which shout is the loudest and should be followed up. Certainly, Milton could not have anticipated this use of his word. Being an inventive thinker himself, though, he would probably have applauded it. Finally, let's turn to page 476, the Richard Rodriguez and his analysis of the time period. Again, just to remind you, on page 476, Rodriguez, born in 1944, is a distinguished nonfiction author and journalist who often presents his views on public TV. His books include Hunger of Memory, and you can read the rest of the titles there. Let's read here about From Small Towns to Big Cities and take a few notes. In high school, Whenever teachers assigned text of British literature, I responded most to the idea of London. I lived in Sacramento at that time, more a town than a city. By senior year, because my body and mind were growing, I began to feel the need of a city, a place of contest and ambition. I left home, as so many seekers of fortune in English novels leave home, for the city. London, market for commodities and ideas. London, at the beginning of the 18th century, was becoming the center of the world. I'd want you to write that down. By the beginning of the 18th century, London was becoming the center of the world. Most of the world's commodities and many of the world's ideas passed through London. A city of so much invested interest was interested. People required news of ships, of trade, of exploration. To get the news, people required newspapers. Londoners also wanted to read about themselves, about plays and books, about fashions and personalities. The birth of the spectre, top of 477. In 1711, an ex-soldier and ex-scholar named Richard Steele published a journal called The Spectator. The Spectator's innovation was to notice and to comment upon the social and moral life of London. Steele enlisted a young writer named Joseph Addison to contribute to the paper. Addison developed the persona of the specter. Quote, "I am frequently seen in most public places, but I live in the world rather as a spectator of mankind than as one of the species." End quote. Addison's essays are fictional observations of real places and real habits. They remain among the best records we have of how several classes of men and women behaved and thought and spoke in London in the 18th century. Joining the conversation of cities. It was my ambition when I left my school books behind to join the conversation of cities. I became a journalist. My fate, as Addison might have foretold, in order to write, one must seek solitude. To create a public voice, one must choose loneliness. Addison benefited from his solitude as a spectator. He was thrilled to have found readers in the male clubs and coffee houses of London, and he also wanted women readers. When I was in high school and teachers instructed me to compose an essay, I never wondered about my reader. My reader was the teacher, her ear a pair of spectacles, her voice a fluent red ink. What one never learns in high school about writing is just how large the world is and how a writer in the world must find an audience, must seduce, amuse, or infuriate a stranger's attention. The beginning and end of print. Last heading on 477. The reading audience of 18th century London was avid, middle class, growing as the city was growing, whereas we live near the end of a long age of print. Now, fewer people read for their news, fewer still for their pleasure. Today's blogger, tossing words into the void of the web, must sense this. I sense it, writing for newspapers. Yet one is confident that one is somehow recorded. One lives in the age of mass media, after all. But writing, although lonely, cannot be completed alone. In order to write, in order to continue writing, the reader needs to find, as Addison found, a reader. You, someone willing to complete the meaning of this sentence by the act of reading. Notice your speaking and listening collaboration box here. Rodriguez compares his career to that of British author Joseph Addison, who says, Rodriguez was thrilled to have found readers in the male clubs and coffee houses of London. These coffee houses were places where people exchanged news and ideas as well as conducted business. And then notice here they ask you to formulate a media evaluation that answers the following questions. What techniques did the artist use to convey favorable or unfavorable impression of such a place, and what social and personal values was the artist promoting? Go ahead and turn to 478 real quickly. You've got some integrative and evaluative information there, questions 1 through 4, that I hope you will take a look at. All right, so there you go, an introduction to Unit 3. We'll now turn to analysis of text. Thank you.